An honor name spoken in the Lakota tongue was a thing of spirit and blood, earned in battle or through great wisdom. It was a title that reshaped a person's soul forever, binding them to the history of the people. Such names were not given lightly, and never ever to an outsider. So how did Amara Vance, a woman from Boston, who knew more about pressed flowers than frontiers, a white woman living on the very edge of the land that had been seized from them, come to possess one? This isn't a story about a simple rescue. It's a story about how in the violent, unforgiving heart of the Wild West, a debt of honor forced a warrior to choose between his people's hatred and a truth he could not deny. The Black Hills of Dakota Territory in 1878 were a wound that refused to close. Gold, the yellow metal that drove white men mad, had been the scalpel that carved the heart out of all. The Sioux Nation's sacred Paha Sapa. The treaty lay broken, its promises turned to dust blowing through the raw new mining towns like Red Creek, a place that clung to the side of a ravine like a desperate gambler to his last coin. This was the world Amara Ellie Vance had chosen, or rather the world she had fled to. Back in Boston, she was the ghost of a scandal, the jilted fiancé of a man whose family fortune was built on whispers and shadows. Her own family, suffocated by the shame, had effectively exiled her with a modest inheritance, suggesting the invigorating Western air might cure her of her public humiliation. They hoped she would be forgotten. In many ways, so did she. Ellie was not a typical homesteader. Her small, sturdy cabin, built a mile upstream from the boisterous clamor of Red Creek, was less a home and more a laboratory. She wasn't here to plow the land or raise cattle. She was a botanical illustrator, a quiet dissenter from a world that expected women to paint watercolors of fruit bowls, not the intricate, resilient flora of the wilderness. Her joy was in the delicate veins of a pasque flower, the fierce thorns of a wild rose, the subtle color variations in lichen clinging to granite. Her days were spent in silent communion with the things that grew, the things that endured. But survival in the Dakotas required more than a keen eye for petals and stems. It required a willful blindness. To live in Red Creek was to live in a cauldron of simmering hatred. The men who drank at the Dusty Spur Saloon were veterans of Custer's disastrous campaign, or prospectors who'd found nothing but dirt and blamed the Sioux for their failure. Their conversations were laced with venom stories of raids and scalping some true many embellished that served as fuel for their collective fear. The leader of this chorus of resentment was a man named Jebediah Thorne. He was a gaunt figure, with a face like dried leather and eyes that held a permanent squint, as if forever staring into a sun that had wronged him. Thorne had lost his claim, his partner, and what little dignity he had to a combination of bad luck and worse whiskey. But he'd found a new purpose in being the town's self-appointed Indian expert. They ain't human, not really. He'd pronounce his voice a gravelly rasp that cut through the saloon's fug. They're like wolves. You see one, there's a pack of 'em hiding in the shadows, waiting to rip the throat out of good Christian folk. Ellie heard these pronouncements whenever she made the necessary trip into town for supplies. She would clutch her shopping list, her eyes fixed on the boardwalk, trying to make herself as small as possible. She saw the suspicion in the eyes of the women, the leering curiosity in the eyes of the men. A single woman, living alone. She was an anomaly, an affront to the natural order of things, and therefore an object of gossip and mistrust. Her only real connection to the town was a grudging respect. From the blacksmith, a burly German named Karl, who appreciated her prompt payment and her quiet demeanor. It was Karl who warned her. "Be careful by the creek, Fräulein Vance," he'd said one afternoon, hammering a glowing horseshoe. "The hills have eyes, not just the four-legged kind." Ellie knew what he meant. Sometimes on her expeditions she felt it. A prickling on her neck, a sense of being watched from the high ridges that flanked the valley. On rare occasions she would catch a glimpse of them, a lone rider on a pony silhouetted against the vast sky. His form so still he seemed part of the landscape itself. They were Lakota, Sioux, the ghosts who haunted the edges of Red Creek's stolen paradise. The sight filled her with a cocktail of emotions. She couldn't untangle the fear she'd been taught in town. A deep, abiding sorrow for what had been done to them, and a powerful academic curiosity. These were the people of this land. They knew the names of the plants she drew not in Latin, but in a language that was as old as the rocks. They knew their uses, their spirits. One sweltering afternoon in late August, she ventured further up the canyon than usual, following a vein of rare star-shaped gentian. The air was thick and still, the sky a bleached-out blue. The creek, the lifeblood of the valley, was a mere trickle whispering over sun-baked stones. She found a shaded spot beneath a cluster of ponderosa pines, pulled out her sketchbook, and lost herself in the precise meditative work of capturing the flower on paper. Hours passed. The sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and rose. A cool breeze, a welcome relief, snaked down from the high country. It carried with it a scent she hadn't noticed before, the smell of distant rain, of damp earth. She looked up. The sky to the west, previously clear, was now bruised with dark, heavy clouds. They piled on top of each other, an ominous fortress of purple and grey. A flicker of movement at the edge of the woods caught her eye. 2 boys. They couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. They were Lakota. Dressed in simple buckskin leggings and tunics, their black hair long and unbound, they were chasing grasshoppers near the creek bed. Their laughter, clear and sharp, echoed in the unnervingly quiet air. Ellie froze. Every warning from Jebediah Thorne screamed in her mind. They're never alone. A trick, a trap. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She stayed perfectly still behind her screen of pines, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. The boys seemed oblivious to her, their world consumed by their game. They were brothers, that much was clear from their easy camaraderie. The older one, taller and more serious, would point, and the younger, more energetic one would leap, his small body a whirl of motion. The wind picked up, rustling the pine needles above her. The light in the canyon was fading fast, not from the setting sun, but from the monstrous cloud cover that was now directly overhead. A low, almost imperceptible rumble vibrated through the soles of her boots. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of the earth itself. Ellie, the botanist, the observer of natural phenomena, understood. She had read about it in geological surveys of the West. The granite canyons, the dry creek beds, they were perfect funnels. A heavy downpour in the high country miles away could transform a trickle into a liquid battering ram in minutes. A flash flood. She looked at the boys, still laughing, still playing in the very center of the dry wash. They were in a death trap and had no idea. The distant rumble was growing louder, a steady, menacing roar that was beginning to drown out the wind. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Fear of the boys of who might be watching from the trees. But it was being overtaken by a different, more urgent terror. The terror of watching 2 children die. She was an outsider to everyone here, to the town that scorned her, and to the people who haunted the hills. Intervening was madness. To approach them was to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. But to do nothing, to sit in silence and listen to that approaching roar, to watch those 2 small, laughing figures be erased from the world. That was a different kind of madness, one she knew she couldn't live with. Taking a deep breath, her decision-made Amara Vance stepped out from the cover of the pines. Her voice when she called out was thin and reedy against the growing symphony of destruction. "Get out of the creek! Now!" The boys spun around, their game forgotten. Their faces were masks of shock and alarm, not at the approaching sound, but at her. The white woman, the intruder. They stared at her, frozen by a fear far older and more immediate than any flood. And behind them, the roar of the water was no longer distant. It was here. For a heartbeat, the world was frozen in a tableau of mutual terror. Ellie saw the unadulterated fear in the boy's eyes. Fear of her. To them, she was the monster, a sudden apparition from a hostile world, more tangible and immediate than the abstract danger rumbling towards them. The younger boy, whose name she would later learn was Changte, or Heart, took a step back, stumbling on a loose rock. His older brother, Wang Bli, or Eagle, instinctively put an arm out, shielding him, his small face a mixture of defiance and panic. "Run!" Ellie screamed again, her voice raw. She didn't just point to the canyon walls. She started scrambling towards them herself, hoping they would follow her example. The sound was no longer a rumble. It was a physical force, a grinding, chewing roar that vibrated in her teeth. The ground trembled. Small pebbles danced on the rocks around her. They didn't move. They were paralyzed by a lifetime of warnings from their own elders about the Wasichu, the white people who took everything. There was no more time for words. Ellie closed the distance in a desperate sprint. She grabbed Wang Bli's arm. The boy flinched as if burned, trying to pull away. His eyes were wide with shock at her touch. "Nahan, Nahan." He yelled a Lakota word for no. That needed no translation. "I'm sorry." She gasped, her grip tightening. She was stronger than she looked, her arms wiry from years of hiking and carrying supplies. She half dragged, half pushed him towards the steep side of the ravine. Changte, seeing his brother being manhandled by this strange white woman, let out a cry of distress and, driven by an instinct to stay with his siblings, scrambled after them. The first tongue of the flood appeared around the canyon bend. It wasn't water. It was a churning brown wall of mud tree limbs and rocks moving with the speed of a freight train. It was a liquid beast, and the sound it made was the sound of the world being torn apart. They had seconds. The canyon wall was steep, a treacherous slope of loose scree and thorny bushes. There was no path. Up Ellie yelled, shoving Wang Bli towards a thick root snaking out from the earth. Climb. For the first time, a flicker of understanding crossed Wang Bli's face. He turned his head and saw the monstrous wave. The fear of her was instantly eclipsed by the primal terror of the flood. He needed no more encouragement. He clawed at the dirt, his small hands finding purchase on the root. Ellie turned and scooped up Changte. He was light, but squirming with panic. She practically threw him onto the slope above her, pushing him from behind. "Go! Follow your brother!" She scrambled after them, her leather shoes slipping on the loose gravel. Her sketchbook and pencils, her connection to her old safe life, were forgotten, lying in the path of the deluge. A thorny branch ripped a long bleeding gash down her forearm, but she barely felt it. All that mattered was the climb. The wall of water hit the place where they had been standing with a concussive boom that shook the very bedrock. The sound was deafening. A spray of muddy water, cold as ice, shot up, drenching them. Chang Te screamed as the water lashed his legs. Ellie, positioned just below him, felt the powerful suction try to pull her back down. She dug her fingers into the soil, her nails breaking, and held on, shielding the boy's small body with her own. The main torrent was a horrifying spectacle. It was 10 feet high, a roiling mass of destruction. Entire trees ripped from the earth, tumbled end over end like matchsticks. The sound was a chaotic medley of roaring water, the sharp crack of boulders colliding, and the agonized groan of the land itself. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and shattered pine. They climbed. It was a desperate animalistic scramble. Wang Bli, agile and terrified, led the way. Ellie stayed below Chang Te, constantly pushing him upward, encouraging him with short, sharp words. Keep going. Almost there. Don't look down. Her lungs burned. Her muscles screamed. The gash on her arm throbbed warm blood, mixing with the cold mud. Finally, Wang Bli found it a narrow ledge barely 2 feet wide, protected by a granite overhang. It wasn't much, but it was 20 feet above the raging torrent. He hauled himself onto it, then immediately turned his face pale with shock and reached down for his brother. Ellie gave Chang Te one last mighty shove, and Wang Bli, and he managed to pull the smaller boy to safety. Now it was her turn. She was exhausted, her arms trembling with fatigue. She reached for the ledge, her muddy fingers finding a crack in the rock. As she tried to pull herself up, her foot slipped on a wet patch of scree. For a terrifying second, she dangled her entire body weight, held by one hand. Her grip began to fail. She saw the churning chaos below her, a maelstrom that would swallow her whole. This is it, she thought, a strange calmness washing over her. This is where the scandal ends. Then she felt a hand on her wrist, small but strong. She looked up. Wang Bli was lying on his stomach, his face inches from hers, his expression one of fierce, terrified concentration. He had her. Chang Te was behind him, his small hands wrapped around his brother's waist, anchoring him. They were saving her. With a surge of adrenaline, Ellie found a new foothold. She kicked against the rock face, and with the boys pulling with all their might, she flopped onto the ledge, gasping for air, her body a wreck of trembling muscles and raw nerves. They lay there for a long time. 3 figures, huddled on a tiny rock shelf, listening to the symphony of destruction below. The flood raged for what felt like an eternity. The initial violent wave was followed by a powerful, sustained river that filled the canyon from wall to wall. The sun had set, and a cold, miserable rain began to fall, plastering their hair to their faces and chilling them to the bone. Ellie shivered not just from the cold, but from the shock. She looked at the boys. They were huddled together, their eyes wide and dark, fixed on the churning water. The defiance was gone, replaced by a profound, childlike shock. Chang Te was shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. Acting on instinct, Ellie shifted, positioning herself to block the worst of the wind-driven rain. She drew them closer, pulling them into the folds of her wet, muddy skirt and jacket. At first they were stiff, their bodies rigid with the ingrained mistrust of her. But the cold was a more powerful force than conditioning. Slowly, tentatively, they leaned into her warmth. She wrapped her arms around them, the three of them becoming a single, shivering unit against the storm. She felt Chang Te's small body relax, his shivering, subsiding slightly as he absorbed her body heat. Wang Bli remained tense for longer, a silent, proud sentinel. But eventually he too succumbed to exhaustion and cold resting his head against her shoulder. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her arm. They didn't speak. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between their worlds, nothing to say in the face of such overwhelming natural fury. There was only the shared grim reality of survival. The cold, the wet, the roar of the water, and the fragile, unexpected warmth of three bodies huddled together on a ledge. As darkness consumed the canyon, Ellie held the two Sioux boys, the sons of her enemies, and felt a profound and aching sense of connection she had never known in the parlors of Boston or the suspicious streets of Red Creek. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of the brutal, beautiful, terrifying landscape of the West, her fate now inextricably tied to the two young lives she had saved, and who in a small but crucial way had just saved her right back. The debt was already more complicated than she could ever have imagined, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the rain that the flood was only the beginning of the storm. The night was a long, cold purgatory. The roar of the flood eventually subsided to a deep, gurgling growl as the water level slowly dropped, leaving behind a scarred landscape of mud and debris. The rain eased to a miserable drizzle. Huddled on the ledge, sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Ellie's exhausted body. The boys were quiet, lapsing into a state of shocked exhaustion, their warmth a small comfort against the damp chill. Dawn broke not with color, but with a slow gray dilution of the darkness. The world it revealed was one of profound devastation. The canyon floor was unrecognizable, a wasteland of glistening mud, uprooted trees, and freshly carved channels. Ellie's small camp, her sketchbook, her satchel of drawing tools, all were gone, swallowed by the flood. As the light grew, Wang Bli stirred. He sat up, his movements stiff, and surveyed the damage. His face was grim, the face of a child forced into premature adulthood. He looked at Ellie, his dark eyes unreadable. There was no longer fear, but something else, a deep, assessing curiosity. He said nothing, but a silent question hung in the air between them. A sound from the canyon rim above them made them all freeze. It was the call of a hawk, sharp and clear. But it was answered from the other side of the canyon. A signal. Wang Bli's head snapped up. A look of immense relief washed over his face. He stood on the precarious ledge and let out an answering call, a surprisingly powerful cry from such a small body. A few moments later, a figure appeared on the ridge directly above them, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. He was tall and lean, with the powerful build of a man who lived a hard life. He moved with a liquid grace, even on the treacherous, muddy ground. Even from a distance, Ellie could feel the intensity of his presence. He was a warrior. As he drew closer, she saw the sharp planes of his face, the long, unbound black hair, and the fierce, protective fury in his eyes. This was their brother, and he was terrified. Chang Te Wang Bli. His voice boomed, filled with a desperate relief that echoed in the ruined canyon. He half slid, half climbed down the steep embankment to their ledge. The boys scrambled to meet him, throwing their arms around his waist, their composure finally breaking. They spoke in a rapid torrent of Lakota, their voices overlapping, filled with the terror and relief of their ordeal. The warrior held them tight, his eyes closed, his face a mask of profound gratitude. Then, as he listened to their story, his eyes opened and fell on Ellie. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a wall of ice. It was a look she had seen before in the faces of the men in Red Creek. Only this was its mirror image. The same hatred, the same suspicion, born of the same history of violence and mistrust, just pointed in the opposite direction. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. He saw a white woman, disheveled and muddy with his brothers. His mind, conditioned by years of conflict, leaped to the most logical, most terrible conclusion. She was responsible. This was a trap. Wang Bli, seeing the look, pulled away from his brother's embrace. He stepped forward, placing himself between the warrior and Ellie. "Thashun ke luta hinung," he said, his voice firm. "Brother." He pointed a small, muddy finger at Ellie. "Wingyan kinjile." He began speaking with an earnestness that was impossible to doubt. This woman. He recounted the story in their native tongue, his words punctuated by gestures pointing to the dry wash where they had played, to the high ledge where they now stood, to the gash on Ellie's arm. Chang Te nodded vigorously, adding his own small details. Ellie stood frozen, watching the warrior's face. His name was Thashun Ko Luta Red Horse. As he listened to his younger brothers, his expression shifted through a kaleidoscope of emotions. The initial fury gave way to confusion, then to a grudging disbelief, and finally to something complex and unreadable. He looked from his brothers' earnest faces to Ellie's exhausted, mud-streaked form. He looked at the devastation around them, the undeniable evidence of the flood's power. The story, as impossible as it seemed, fit the facts. He had come prepared for a fight, for a rescue, or for a grim recovery. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared for a debt. His gaze lingered on the bloody tear in her sleeve. He took a hesitant step forward and spoke not to her, but to the air in front of her. His English was slow, deliberate, each word carved from stone. "You pull them from water." Ellie found her voice, though it was hoarse. There wasn't time to do anything else. Red Horse stared at her, his mind grappling with a new reality. The Wasichu were invaders, treaty breakers, killers. They were a monolithic force of destruction. But this one woman, this solitary figure, had risked her own life to save 2 Lakota children. It was a fact that did not compute. It broke the simple, brutal arithmetic of his world. He gave a curt, sharp nod. It was not thanks. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation of a fact that now existed between them. He turned his back to her, speaking softly to his brothers in Lakota, checking them for injuries. Then, without another word or glance at Ellie, he began the difficult process of getting his siblings back up to the canyon rim. Ellie was left alone on the ledge. The adrenaline that had sustained her for hours drained away, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. Getting back to her own cabin was an ordeal. She had to climb down from the ledge, navigate the treacherous, mud-slicked canyon floor, and force her aching body on a 2-mile trek. Every step was a battle. When she finally stumbled through her own doorway, she was a ghost of herself. She cleaned and bandaged the gash on her arm, her movements clumsy with exhaustion. She collapsed onto her cot, the world spiraling into a grey haze of fatigue. When she awoke, it was late afternoon. Her body ached, but her mind was clear. A terrible thought began to dawn on her. She had been seen with the Sioux. She had touched them, helped them. In the eyes of Red Creek, her crime was not just trespassing, it was treason. Her fears were confirmed 2 days later on a supply run. The moment she stepped onto the boardwalk, she felt the change. The usual whispers and curious stares were replaced by something harder, more hostile. Jebediah Thorne and his cronies were standing outside the general store. As she approached, Thorne spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to her skirt hem. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it ain't the Indian lover. Heard you was down by the creek, getting real friendly with some of Red Horse's whelps." Ellie's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice tight. "Oh, I think you do." Thorne shot back. "We seen the tracks. 3 sets, one of 'em wearing ladies' shoes. You think we're stupid. They're getting bolder, coming right into the valley. And they got help from traitors right here in this town." His eyes were small, hard points of malice. Ellie grabbed her supplies. Her hands trembling paid the storekeeper who refused to meet her eye and fled. The walk back to her cabin was a gauntlet of hostile stares. She was no longer just an oddity. She was a pariah. Meanwhile, in a hidden camp deep in the hills, Red Horse was wrestling with a crisis of conscience. He owed this woman a debt. It was not a matter of choice. It was a fundamental law of his culture. A life saved had to be acknowledged. To ignore it would bring shame not just upon him, but upon his family. It would be a disharmonious act, an offense against the spirits. But how could he repay a debt to a white woman? To approach her was to risk being seen to invite violence upon himself and his people. To give her a gift would be misunderstood. He consulted with an elder of his band, a wise, wrinkle-faced man named Chaitin or Falcon. Chaitin listened to the story in silence, his eyes closed as if watching it unfold in his mind. When Red Horse had finished, he spoke softly. "The water does not choose who it drowns. It is a power of the world. This woman stood against that power for our children. The debt is not to a Wasichu. It is a debt to the spirit that moved through her. It must be honored." The elder's words settled the conflict in Red Horse's soul. He knew what he had to do. A week after the flood, Ellie was sitting in her cabin at dusk, trying to concentrate on a new drawing, when a soft sound outside her door made her jump. It was the sound of a single footstep. Not the heavy, clumsy tread of a townsman, but something light, deliberate. Silent. Her heart leaped into her throat. Thorne. He'd come to make good on his threats. She grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace, her knuckles white. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, only silence. Then a low voice, the same one she'd heard in the canyon, spoke through the wooden door. The woman who is not afraid of water. It was Red Horse. Ellie's fear was instantly replaced by a profound confusion. She slowly unbarred the door and opened it a crack. He was standing there alone, bathed in the deep purple light of twilight. He held no weapon. In his hands he carried a small, beautifully beaded pouch. He did not try to enter. He simply stood on her doorstep, his presence filling the small clearing. "My brothers are safe," he said, his gaze direct and unnervingly intense. They are warm. They laugh again. This is because of you." Ellie didn't know what to say. "I'm glad they're all right. A life for a life is the way of the warrior." He continued, his voice low. "I cannot give you a life, but my family owes you. My people do not understand this. They see only the color of your skin." He paused, choosing his words with immense care. "But I see what you did. An honorable action must have an honorable name." He took a step forward and held out the small pouch. "In our way, we give thanks. A wopila. This is a small thing, but we also give a name to mark what a person is." He looked at her, his eyes locking onto hers. "You were not a sister, not a mother. You were a stranger. But you stood up. You lifted my brothers from the darkness. So I will call you Miwayaka Wangjila." He said the Lakota words slowly, letting them hang in the still air. "Miwayaka Wangjila," he repeated. "It means the one who lifts up. It is your name now. My family will know you by it. The spirits will know you by it." He placed the beaded pouch on her doorstep, then turned and melted back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. Ellie stood in the doorway, the poker hanging forgotten in her hand. She picked up the pouch. It was filled with dried herbs, sweetgrass and sage. She looked out into the empty darkness where he had been. She had been ostracized by her own people for a crime she did not commit, only to be given the highest of honors by the very people she was supposed to hate. Miwayaka Wangjila, the one who lifts up. Tears streamed down her face. Tears of fear, of relief, of a profound and shattering loneliness. The name was a gift, a secret shield. But it was also a brand one that marked her as belonging to neither world and set her on a collision course with the hatred brewing in Red Creek. The debt had been acknowledged, but the payment she was beginning to realize was far from complete. The name Miwayaka Wangjila settled into Ellie's soul like a stone in a deep pool. It was a secret she kept locked away, a flicker of warmth in a world that was rapidly turning hostile. She would say it to herself in the quiet of her cabin, the Lakota syllables a foreign yet intimate comfort. It was a reminder that in one corner of this vast, harsh land, she was not a pariah, but a person of honor. It was this secret strength she drew upon as the walls of Red Creek's animosity closed in around her. Jebediah Thorne, having found a scapegoat for the town's collective failures and fears, did not let up. He nurtured the seed of suspicion he had planted, watering it with daily doses of rumor and vitriol, until it grew into a thick, thorny vine of open hatred that ensnared the entire community. Ellie's existence shrank, becoming almost entirely confined to her cabin and the small clearing around it. Her weekly trips for supplies transformed from a simple chore into a calculated exercise in quiet endurance. The moment her boots touched the dusty main street, a palpable silence would fall. Conversations on the boardwalk would halt mid-sentence. At the general store, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had once traded tips on preserving peaches, now served her with brisk cold efficiency, refusing to meet her eye, her hands slapping the goods onto the counter as if they were contaminated. Children who once might have offered a shy hello were now pulled away by their mothers, their innocent curiosity replaced by a learned fear. Thorne and his acolytes were a constant presence, a gauntlet she had to pass. They would often be lounging on the saloon porch chairs, tilted back, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Their taunts grew bolder, their words sharpened by the audience they commanded. "Best watch your scalp, boys." Thorne would call out his voice, a malicious drawl that carried across the street. The pretty little traitor might be telling her redskin friends which ones to take first. A wave of cruel laughter would follow, echoing in Ellie's ears, long after she had fled the town's oppressive judgment. The threats soon bled out from the town and into the sanctity of her home. One evening, the sharp crack of shattering glass made her cry out, and she found a jagged rock lying amidst the shards of her windowpane. Another morning, she discovered her small, meticulously tended vegetable garden had been savaged. The tender squash vines were ripped from the earth, the carrots and potatoes uprooted and scattered, a petty and vicious act of destruction that felt deeply personal. It was an attack not just on her sustenance, but on her hope. Fear became her constant companion, a cold, heavy presence in the isolated cabin. She began to sleep with the heavy iron poker from the fireplace resting against her cot. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the pines, every hoot of a distant owl sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She felt like a hunted animal. She considered leaving. The thought was a tempting whisper in her darkest moments. She could pack her few belongings, sell the cabin for whatever she could get, and take the stagecoach back east. She could return to the life of polite shame that awaited her, a life of whispered gossip and averted gazes that was at the very least safe from physical violence. But something held her back. It was more than just stubbornness, more than a refusal to be chased away. It was the name. The one who lifts up. To run would be to betray that name. It would be an admission of the guilt they had assigned her, a final victory for Thorn's poisonous lies. And so, with a resolve that surprised even herself, she stayed. The breaking point came on a moonless night in late September. A freight wagon had delivered a fresh supply of whiskey to Red Creek, and the Dusty Spur saloon was overflowing with the potent, volatile combination of cheap liquor and simmering resentment. Thorn, in his element, saw his chance to transform himself from town drunk into town leader. He climbed onto a rickety table, his gaunt frame casting a long, distorted shadow in the flickering lantern light. For weeks we've been watching. He slurred, his voice rising above the din. The saloon grew quiet as the men turned to listen. That woman up the creek. She's a spy, I tell ya. You noticed how quiet it's been. Red Horse and his butchers. They ain't been seen for a month. You know why. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity. They're planning something. They're massing in the hills, getting ready to strike, and she's their eyes and ears. A murmur of drunken, fearful agreement rippled through the crowd. Thorn's words landed on fertile ground, validating every paranoid fear they harbored. Are we gonna wait? Thorn roared, raising a fist. Are we gonna sit here drinking while they sharpen their knives? Wait for them to come in the night and burn our homes? For them to do to our women what they do? He didn't need to be specific. The vile insinuation hung in the thick, smoky air, and faces hardened. Or are we going to go up there and get some answers? Show her what we do with traitors. He had them. The raw fear stoked by whiskey and ignorance had finally boiled over. A mob was born. Men grabbed lanterns, rifles that had been leaning against the wall, and even farm implements from the backs of their wagons. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering, unsteady light of the lanterns, were twisted with a righteous, ugly fury. They were no longer prospectors or blacksmiths or farmers. They were a righteous tide of vengeance, and they began their clumsy, angry march up the creek towards Ellie's cabin. Carl, the blacksmith, who had been nursing a beer in the corner, watched them go, with a sick feeling churning in his stomach. He knew Ellie wasn't a traitor. He knew Thorn was a poison-tongued liar. This was wrong, deeply wrong. But to stand against the mob was to become its next target. He stayed put, his conscience at war with his instinct for self-preservation, the taste of his beer turning to ash in his mouth. Inside her cabin, Ellie heard them coming. It started as a low murmur, a collection of distant angry shouts that slowly grew louder, blending with the frantic thumping of her own heart. She rushed to the window and saw it a swarm of bobbing lights like angry fireflies weaving through the trees, coming directly for her. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. This was it. They were going to drag her out. They were going to enact their drunken justice. She scrambled to the door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely slide the thick wooden beam into its iron brackets. She backed away from the door, clutching the poker, her knuckles white. Her back pressed against the cold stone of the fireplace, as if she could melt into it. The shouts were just outside now, a cacophony of slurred threats and accusations battering her sanctuary. "Come on out, traitor. We know you're in there, squaw lover." A heavy rock slammed against the door with a deafening boom, making the whole cabin shake. The wood splintered, and fine dust rained down from the rafters. They were going to break it down. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, a desperate, silent prayer catching in her throat. And then a new sound, or rather a sudden, shocking lack of it. The shouting stopped. It didn't fade away. It was sliced off as if by a knife. It was replaced by a confused, frightened, and utterly unnatural silence. Ellie opened her eyes, her brow furrowed. What was happening? The silence was in its own way more terrifying than the noise. It was the silence of a predator's arrival. Outside, the mob had frozen. The men at the front of the pack had stopped dead in their tracks, causing those behind them to stumble forward into a bewildered shuffling pile. Their drunken courage evaporated like mist, replaced by a sudden, sober terror that chilled them to the bone. Standing between them and Ellie's cabin, arranged in a silent crescent line, were 5 figures. They had materialized from the moonless darkness, as if born from the shadows themselves. They were on foot, armed with bows and war clubs, their forms radiating a calm, lethal stillness. At their center, tall and immovable as a mountain pine, was Thashungike Luta Red Horse. He wasn't dressed for war. He wore simple buckskin, and his face was unpainted. But his presence was more intimidating than any army. His face was calm, his eyes holding a chilling stillness as they swept over the terrified faces of the mob. One of his younger brothers, Chang Te, had taken to watching Ellie's cabin from the distant hills, a self-appointed guardian, repaying a debt in his own way. He had seen the mob forming and had run faster than he had ever run in his life to warn his older brother. Red Horse and his warriors had not come to attack Red Creek. They had come to defend one small cabin. Jebediah Thorn stood at the head of the mob, his rifle half raised. The sight of Red Horse, the very man he'd used to stoke the town's fears, the devil, in all his stories, standing as a protector of the woman he'd accused, was a cognitive shock that momentarily scrambled his brain. What is this? Thorn stammered, his voice losing its booming authority. This is town business. You have no right. Red Horse took a single deliberate step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words, spoken in clear, measured English, cut through the night with absolute authority. This woman is Miwayaka Wangjila. he said, speaking the Lakota name like a shield, a declaration. She is under the protection of my family. Her honor is my honor. You will not touch her. He let the words sink into the stunned silence. He was not threatening a raid. He was not declaring war. He was stating a fact, a law of honor that the drunken mob, in their own crude way, could understand. He had come not to destroy them, but to stop them from destroying themselves with their own hatred. It was an inverted siege. The savages were protecting a white woman from the savagery of civilized men. She's a witch, one of the men stammered, his voice trembling. She's bewitched you. Red Horse's gaze fell upon him, calm and heavy, and the man shrank back as if physically struck. She is a woman who pulled my brothers from a flood while you hid in your wooden houses afraid of the rain. Red Horse said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every man present. He paused, letting them absorb the shame of his words. Who here has more honor? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. No one moved. No one spoke. There was only the sound of the wind whispering through the pines and the crackle of the mob's lanterns. The standoff was absolute, a line of 5 silent warriors and a mob of 30 armed men, paralyzed by the undeniable moral force of an enemy who refused to act like one. Finally, from the back of the crowd, a voice boomed with the authority of hammered steel. That's enough, Jebediah. It was Carl the blacksmith. His conscience had won. He'd followed them, unable to live with his inaction. He pushed his way to the front, his broad shoulders clearing a path, his face grim. He's right. This is madness. Go home. Carl's intervention broke the spell. He was one of them, a man they respected. His words gave them the permission they needed to retreat without completely losing face. The men, their drunken courage gone, their righteous fury revealed as the ugly thing it was, began to look at each other with shame. They lowered their rifles. They mumbled apologies to no one in particular. They began to drift away, in 2s and 3s, their lanterns casting long, retreating shadows, until only Jebediah Thorne was left standing alone, exposed and pathetic in the ring of light. He gave Red Horse a look of pure, undiluted hatred, then turned and slunk back into the darkness from which he'd come. Red Horse watched until the last light was gone. He held his position for a few moments longer, a silent sentinel, ensuring the threat was truly over. Then he turned his head and looked at the cabin door. Ellie, who had watched the entire impossible scene through a crack in the shutter, felt the strength return to her legs. She slowly unbarred the door and stepped outside into the cool, clean night air. She looked at Red Horse, her heart too full for words. He had repaid his debt not with a gift, but with his life, with his honor. He had stood against her people to protect her. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of a debt paid in full, of a circle closed. Then, as silently as they had arrived, he and his warriors turned and vanished back into the trees, leaving Ellie Vance standing safe in the sudden, peaceful quiet of the night. She never saw Red Horse again, but the story of that night became a reluctant legend in Red Creek, told in hushed tones. Jebediah Thorne lost all credibility, becoming a bitter, ignored old man who talked only to his whiskey glass. Ellie Vance was no longer a pariah. She was treated with a new, grudging and fearful respect. She was the woman the Sioux had protected. She was an outsider who had been given an honor no one else could claim. She stayed in her cabin for many more years, a quiet fixture of the landscape, forever living between two worlds, bound by a name spoken in a language she would never learn, but whose meaning she understood with every fiber of her being. She was the one who lifts up. The story of Amara Vance and Red Horse is a powerful reminder that the Wild West was more than just cowboys and outlaws. It was a complex place of colliding cultures where the lines between friend and foe, hero and villain, were often blurred. In a world defined by conflict, they discovered a truth that transcends any language or law, that an act of courage creates an obligation and a debt of honor, is more binding than any treaty. True strength isn't found in hatred or suspicion, but in the rare, difficult choice to see the humanity in someone you've been taught to despise. If this story of courage and honor resonated with you, please help it reach others by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of the true, complicated history of the American West. And for more stories that dig deeper into the past, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Thank you for listening.